Hey, podcast family. Today I've brought back my friend and colleague, Dr. Marc Sklar, a.k.a. the Fertility Expert, to talk all about egg freezing. With 2 decades of experience, he's dedicated to helping couples navigate the often complex path to parenthood. Marc's mission is to illuminate your way forward and provide the answers you need to improve your reproductive health and achieve your dream of having a beautiful family. In addition to his Doctor of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, Marc trained at the Harvard Medical School Mind Body Medical Institute. He is the creator of marcsklar.com and reproductivewellness.com, the co-author of Secret to Conception, and a fellow of the American Board of Oriental Reproductive Medicine and medical advisor for Natural Health International. So, in this episode, Marc demystifies the process of egg freezing from start to finish. His extensive expertise helps us understand the medical aspects associated with egg freezing and the ideal age range often suggested by the industry. We discuss what factors could indicate earlier or later consideration for egg freezing and examine whether women might be jumping into this practice too hastily when other options exist. Marc also enlightens us on the actual success rates of egg freezing and whether we're sometimes fed overly optimistic expectations. This one is going to be surprising for you when you hear it. We delve into the symptoms and side effects associated with the process, as well as key fertility tests women should consider. Plus, he shares insights into dietary and lifestyle changes during the process and provides a holistic view of the costs involved. But the conversation doesn't stop there. We also explore alternative options for fertility preservation, such as embryo freezing, and Marc guides us through the steps after egg freezing, addressing potential complications and sharing advice for women contemplating this path. This in-depth conversation could change the way you view fertility preservation. You'll find more information on Marc's Instagram at _fertility_expert or his YouTube channel. And don't forget to share about this episode with anyone considering egg freezing if you've loved what you heard. Also, I would love it if you left a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every single one of those helps boost this podcast and gets it seen by more people. Thank you so much for being here as always, and enjoy the episode. Hi, Marc. Welcome back
Hi
to the
there.
show. So
My
happy
pleasure.
you're here.
It's so nice to be here. And I think this is going to be a really awesome conversation. We kind of touched on it, I think, maybe hinted at it last time we spoke. So
We hinted. Yes, we did indeed. And I really wanted to invite you back to speak about this because this is a practice that's had a bit of a meteoric rise in popularity. And in fact, I was reading a number of different articles about it, and they all claim different numbers, but it's somewhere between like a 400 and 1,000% increase in the women who've frozen their eggs since 2009. I feel like that's a pretty big deal.
it's a huge deal, right? And those numbers actually show that, which tells you where the fertility industry is putting a lot of their energy and resources. So if you think of if we can take our emotions out of it and think of the fertility industry, and I am referring to it as an industry because it totally is a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide, and each industry is always looking for new ways to generate more revenue, right? So how can we generate more revenue? Well, I think as an industry, they have seen that there's an opportunity to market towards younger women to save their eggs. And I think that's where this is coming from. I also think the other piece to this that we need to recognize is that the fertility industry has evolved over time, where each fertility clinic used to be owned by, let's say, one or two doctors in the practice. Maybe they opened up a few satellite offices throughout the state or the region because they wanted to help other people and be able to reach larger populations. So let's just say like New York or Los Angeles is really a great example of it, because you have one clinic in, let's just say, Beverly Hills. People in Los Angeles don't want to drive if they don't need to. It's, a hassle to be on the highways, and to get anywhere, it takes hours. So they live in these little silos. So someone who lives in Beverly Hills is never going to go to the Valley, and someone who lives in the Valley is never going to come to Beverly Hills and Pasadena and so forth, right? So in those situations, these individual clinics and doctors who created these clinics and own them would open up little satellite offices throughout the greater Los Angeles area to be able to serve those communities, and that made a lot of sense, right?
Right.
But what's happened over the years is that venture capitalist firms have seen that, wow, fertility is a big business and it's a big industry, and so we want part of it. That's what they say. And so, well, let's go buy up some fertility clinics, right? And so as a result, they see that there's one clinic that has, let's just say, 5 locations. They're like, well, that makes sense as a place to start, right? So let's start with those. And so they've been buying up these bigger clinics. And so much so that now they're buying up the smaller clinics as well. And I'm not saying that all the clinics are owned by venture capitalist firms. There's plenty that are not, but I think you've got to actually look for that a little bit more, because it's not as straightforward as it may seem. And as a result, venture capitalist firms are all about the dollars. Everything's about like making money and increase our revenue and being able to pay back those people who have invested in to make money, because that's what it's all about. So when they're doing that, how else do you, when you've kind of maxed out, let's just say, and we're not growing at the same rate as we should just doing regular IVF, how else do you do that? Well, they have seen over the years, and I think you said things 2008 or 2009, we've seen this increase. So let's just say they started to see that prior. Now they start to say, well, there's a space that that's lacking, and we can actually market and build up this, which is egg banking. And so as a result, that's why we're starting to see this industry, or this part of this industry, increase in the way that we have, because they're using it as a means to create more revenue. And, a venture capitalist firm has the bottom line at hand. And so that's where their focus is. And so I don't fault them for it. But also they're preying on women who are vulnerable and young, and in some ways a bit naive, to think that, oh, we need to be banking our eggs. And so that's the focus that they're moving forward with. Now, I will say there is absolutely a place for egg banking. There's absolutely a place for egg donations and all of this. I'm not saying that these things are not valuable, but I do believe that there is a population that is probably doing it a bit unnecessarily or prematurely.
Right. This is such good background. And I think it's going to be so helpful for anyone who's listening who is trying to consider whether this is something they should do. And I figure maybe we just go back a little bit and start with just what egg freezing is in simple terms and how it works. And then we'll come
Yeah,
back to this, because I think this is a hugely important topic to talk about, the financial piece.
yeah, absolutely. Well, so egg freezing, similar but different to egg donation. Okay, and we need to do one before the other. So, and I'm not suggesting, but I'm looking these at 2 separate pieces. So, egg freezing is when a woman will go through the egg retrieval portion of in vitro fertilization. The whole process of IVF is the retrieval of eggs, the fertilization with sperm to create embryos, and then putting those embryos back into the uterus to get pregnant. That's the entire process of what a full in vitro fertilization cycle would look like. This piece, which is just the egg retrieval phase, is just that. They're given stimulation medication to stimulate the ovaries to produce as many eggs as they can. And then that usually happens over the stimulation piece usually happens over roughly a 2-week time frame. They might be given some medication prior to that to prepare the body, to prepare the ovaries for that process. And then they retrieve the egg. So they go through the vaginal wall into the ovaries and, literally retrieve out of each follicle the eggs that are there. And then they save those and put them in their own vials to freeze. They used to freeze several eggs at a time in one compartment. Now they isolate them as much as they can to probably no more than 2, depending on the clinic.
Oh, interesting.
And then so they freeze those and bank them. And so the idea is that a woman who, let's just say, is in her 20s or 30s who knows she wants to have a family later on, but is not in a serious relationship right now and is concerned that, what might that be like in the future, and is potentially concerned about their egg quality in the future, is freezing eggs that are younger and theoretically healthier to be used in the future. And that is what the egg freezing process is. And then theoretically, they'd come back at whatever time in the future they found their partner, and they'd say, okay, we're ready to do to fertilize those eggs. And so they'd come back years later. They'd take the egg out, fertilize it with the sperm, allow it to grow to an embryo, and then at some point, do an embryo transfer and hopefully have a successful pregnancy. So that's kind of how that would work in the bigger picture for someone who's going through it.
Right. I'm wondering, I imagine that if someone has frozen their eggs and then they find their partner, that they're probably going to try to get pregnant without going through all of that.
I
Right.
would
I
hope
mean,
so.
I would hope so too.
Yeah,
I hope that's what you
I
all are
mean,
doing out there.
I hope
Yeah.
they're trying the old-fashioned way, in bed before they're going back to the lab. But I will tell you, some people will not do that for sure. And I don't know what that percentage is off the top of my head, but for sure there will be people who will say, well, they will have a misunderstanding to say or think that, IVF is a guarantee. So, why waste time? Let's go back and do that. Let's just fertilize those eggs and go forward. From there, my hope is that they will actually try naturally first.
Yeah, I know. That's my hope too. Everyone, just so you know. So obviously you said, so that sounds like almost like the entire IVF procedure. So can you talk a little bit about that? So are there hormone injections, things of that nature that are happening in the lead up to the egg retrieval process?
Yeah, you're not going through this without doing hormone injections and taking hormones to stimulate your ovaries to produce more eggs. So on any given regular cycle, when you ovulate, you're ovulating one, maturing and ovulating one, typically one, unless you release two and have twins. But in this case, like you're releasing one embryo, one egg to be fertilized every cycle. You're not going to go through an egg retrieval cycle to freeze eggs just to get one. Like that's not worth the money and the effort and the hassle of any of it. So the process there is to get as many, and the hope is to get as many eggs as possible. And so they would love to bank 20, 30, 40 eggs, whatever that number, whatever the max number that they can get. Okay. And so to do that, you have to stimulate your ovaries to produce more eggs, or else you're only going to get that one, maybe two. So they're going to give you more medication. They're going to give you medication to do that. And in a situation like this, it's probably not a place where they're going to give you lower medication, because again, they want as many eggs as they can get. So in most of these situations, their preference is to give as much medication as they can give to stimulate the ovaries to produce as many eggs as possible. So they are giving women FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, in most cases, though that's what those injections are. They're also probably giving them other hormones in lead up to it, estrogen or birth control, maybe growth hormones or testosterone to help try to nurture more and better quality eggs. And then you will be also given what's called a trigger shot to help release the eggs, so that when they go into get the eggs out of the follicles, that the follicles aren't so hard, that they're a little bit riper, almost ready to ovulate and release the eggs, because it makes it easier to get. So you're definitely getting a fair amount of hormones during that process, and rightly so, if that's what you're trying to achieve. Very different than, like, some people might talk about a low dose IVF cycle or a mini IVF cycle or a natural IVF cycle. Those are meant to be done with little to no medication, and that's not typically successful when we're trying to have as many eggs as we can to save.
Okay, right. That's so helpful to know. I love this process. I love the description. And I mean, this has me thinking about potential side effects that come with injecting yourself with all of these hormones. What should people be considering when they're thinking about doing something like this
Yeah,
in terms of
so
side effects?
I mean, side effects, sometimes if someone's really healthy, if they're just going through it one time, the hope is that there is little to no side effects. But with the amount of medication that they're taking, in general, they're going to have bloating, they're going to have weight gain, they're probably going to be fatigued at some point. They're going to be, once those follicles start to grow in those ovaries, you're going to feel really uncomfortable too, because they often use the words, "It feels like my ovaries are popping like popcorn."
Oh, wow.
Okay, so you'll definitely feel it. In an extreme case, if things are not managed properly, there's what's called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, where they've given you too much medication, it was not managed properly, and that can have some pretty severe ramifications if it's not managed well. So often women will end up going into the hospital overnight just to be managed properly. That doesn't seem to happen as much anymore. It happened much more commonly 20 plus years ago. I'm not saying we don't see it, but it's not as likely because we've learned how to manage that better over time. But we still see that on occasion. And in a situation like this, with theoretically a younger woman being given a lot of medication, it's more likely to happen in a scenario like that than otherwise. So yeah, you're definitely on hormones. I think if you have to do that cycle repeatedly, and typically they will ask you to do it in back-to-back cycles. They want to try to do it as close together as possible. The likelihood of having side effects increases with each additional cycle, and increases the closer you do those together to one another. So you will likely have that, and the more you do that, is potentially side effects afterwards. Like it might take a couple of cycles to get back on track, to have a regular menstrual cycle, for your hormones to feel okay, and to get back to where you need to be. I typically coach women and recommend that if you're going to do back-to-back cycles, or even if you've done one, like, let's support you afterwards to detox, to get you back to where you need to be, to help regulate your hormones and get you where you need to be balanced as quickly as possible.
Right. That's really helpful. I just was thinking of a friend a number of years ago. She froze her eggs and had put on a significant amount of weight after the process. And it was like a year later, and she was like, "I'm still really struggling to lose this weight." And so I had never seen that before. So that was one of the symptoms I was thinking about as you were
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah, weight gain is a common symptom. And I will say that I see that less in women who are healthier, who've taken care of themselves, and have also prepared. So, you know, just because you're young and theoretically healthy doesn't mean that you should just walk into an egg retrieval cycle without preparing your body, making sure you've done, you're supporting it as best as you can. So my preference is someone gives themselves at least 3 months to prepare before they go through that. I think they go through it better. They have less side effects. They recover better as well if they're able to do that, versus just jumping in without thinking about it.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know too. Okay. I mean, I feel like we want to prepare for everything though. It's
Yeah.
IVF,
Yeah.
all of it, pregnancy. Yes. Okay. So ladies, you got to prepare for the egg freezing. Um, so you talked in the beginning, actually, I don't think we were recording at this point, when you were talking about the age range. I know that we were saying it's a bit of a, double-edged sword for women who are considering this, because they're told like the younger the better, but at the same time, if you're 27 when your eggs are great, I mean, who the heck is thinking about this kind of thing? And who has the money for this as well? And then who even knows what's going to happen in the next decade of their lives? They could be pregnant with 4 different children. It's like, yeah, it's so weird, because like, what do you do? How do you make that decision? So I'm curious what your recommendations are around the age ranges, because obviously the industry says a little differently.
Yeah, look, obviously it it makes sense on one side of the coin to bank your eggs the younger you are, because the quality is better, and you can theoretically get more. But on the flip side is, do you even know if you need to do that when you're that young, right? Like, you haven't even given yourself a chance to find a partner, have a relationship, get married, and even try. So you don't even know if you need to do it. So it is a double-edged sword, because the ones who would say like, oh, I wish I banked my eggs, are the ones who are 40 and older and didn't do it when they were younger. So it's this, challenging piece, I think, where, if you asked someone who's 42, oh, do you wish you banked your eggs? They're going to say 100%, I wish I did. Right. But they also wouldn't have known that they needed to do that. So it's challenging. I don't like to recommend anyone to bank their eggs until they get to 35 at the earliest. Like, why not give yourself a chance to find a partner, have a relationship, get married, try to have babies, to me, I want you to have that opportunity. So I wouldn't even consider doing that before you were 35. Many fertility clinics would say that's too late. The reality is your 35-year-old eggs are going to be better than your 40-plus-year-old eggs. So, if you're going to do it, I still think that's better. Will you get as many? Probably not. But I just had I think she's either 39 or 40. And she's done exactly what we said. Like, I don't want to bank. I want to find a relationship. She's had a hard time. She just got out of a long-term relationship. And she just said, I can't wait any longer. I want to make sure that I have eggs for when I'm older, for when I do find my partner, if I need them. So she's 39 or 40, and she just went through it. And she did fine. Yeah. But I'm a firm believer, and she had plenty to freeze, but I'm a firm believer in her situation. She's also been really proactive of taking care of herself and taking care of her hormones. And it showed. Her hormones look awesome. They look like a 30-year-old's. And when she was concerned and everyone was telling her all these numbers, I'm like, I'm looking at your hormones. You look great. You're going to be fine. Don't worry about banking. You're going to be fine if you want to move forward with it. Yeah. And so, but that's a different scenario. She did all the things that we're talking about, and then she decided now's the right time for me to bank. But a fertility clinic would say she was too old to do that. Now, she might be too old to bank and donate her eggs, but she's not too old to save her own eggs for herself. So, we have to think about that in a different vacuum as we're contemplating that process. And sure, like, could it be better if you did this when you were 25? Well, yeah, of course, but it's not necessary. And, we also have to think about all the hormones you're going to take to get to that point, like to bank your eggs. And what impact is that going to have on your body, your health, your hormones, your fertility later in life as well? So I'd really like for women to give it some time, to have a real opportunity to try and see. I do think also, if you are younger and you want to have children, and that you have fertility issues, or you have hormone or reproductive issues, I think at 25 is when you should be proactive to take care of those things. Like, that's what that time should be used for at that point in time, not for banking eggs for the future. It should be about preserving your fertility and taking care of yourself, so that when you want to have children, you're better prepared to do that. You also mentioned, and you also mentioned cost, right? Like, yeah, IVF is not inexpensive. The cost of freezing your eggs and storing them the first year is included in the price of the first IVF retrieval cycle. But every year after that, you have to pay for storage. You have to pay, and it might not be a ton of money, but it's probably, depending on how many you have to stored, is anywhere from a few $100s to maybe $1,000 or more, annually, depending on how many you have. So, that's not a number that probably gets discussed or thought about very much until you get the bill the next year and you're like, oh, what's this for? So, there are added costs as a result of doing that. And it's not inexpensive just to do, we're talking about potentially $15,000 to $20,000 each cycle to retrieve. That's not a small amount of money. And I think that really needs to be thought about before you move forward.
Yes, thank you for saying all of this. I talk to women constantly about fertility preservation and the fact that there is no nuance in our society when we talk about egg freezing and IVF and age and all of this stuff, because I know that my hormones at 35, 36, 37 were in much better shape than they were in my 20s because I was not taking myself seriously or taking care of myself really in any way. And so and again, I don't really have testing from my 20s to know, but I know from my cycle what a disaster it was. So I feel like that's the thing, right? It's the myth that at 35, your fertility just falls off a cliff and you're basically doomed to never have those children that you want to have. And there's a lot of fear mongering, particularly around the egg
Yeah.
freezing conversation. And so I just wonder how many women are sort of being goaded into doing this very expensive, and I consider it to be a pretty invasive procedure. I feel like if you're injecting yourself with hormones, that's pretty invasive. And then, like you said, nobody's really talking to them about the fact that you really should be preparing your body for 3 months to build that resilience so that you can handle all of those hormone injections and the retrieval process. I mean, that's a stressor on the body. So, like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I do feel, I think you said this, like that women are being preyed on to some degree. And you said too that a lot of insurance companies will cover this, or companies will cover it for their workers as this like insurance policy. So, yes, we'll make you work to the bone until you're past your reproductive years. But a little bonus we'll give you is that you get to freeze your eggs on our dime.
Right. Yeah. So that could be a reason why someone who's younger says, "Oh, well, I don't have to pay for it. My employer
Right.
is going to pay for it because it's a benefit that I get." So I would say I would caution everybody, like not all benefits by your employer need to be utilized, right? Like just because they're offering it doesn't mean you've got to go inject yourself with hormones to utilize it. I think it's a nice thing that they're offering it, but just to your point, it's like we're going to work you to the bone, but you get this perk as a result. You know, it's wonderful that employers are thinking about fertility overall as part of their benefits when they're putting their benefit packages together. But I would prefer that we are not utilizing those services unless we absolutely need to, and that we're thinking about it in a different way. Like you mentioned, fertility preservation is something that you talk about a lot, and I appreciate that. I think we need to think of of fertility preservation differently. Like when you hear that word, someone's going to say, "Oh, that's just freezing your eggs." Or doing IVF. And I think of that as, well, what do I need to do to preserve my health and fertility so that I can get pregnant at whatever age I want to? And that really starts whenever you're ready to start it, as soon as possible. So you mentioned when you're young and you're in your early 20s, you're just about having fun and you're not thinking about taking care of yourself. We were all there at one point theoretically. And so, but I think at a certain point, once we are working, and let's just use 25 as our gauge, as an age, like we have to start taking our health more seriously. And I think that's the point where we can say, well, I need to start thinking about my overall picture in terms of one, being as healthy as I can. And if I do that, then I can be as fertile as I can. And that's fertility preservation. And I don't think of fertility preservation as just like 3 months or 6 months. I think of it as, hey, as much time as I can give my body to take care of myself and my hormones and my fertility, I should be doing. And so, does it mean you always have to be so strict with yourself? No, but I would prefer that fertility preservation is a woman taking responsibility and ownership of their health and their hormones versus giving that up to somebody else to say, yeah, I'll let you inject me with hormones. We're going to freeze my eggs and I'm not going to take responsibility for my health, right? Like that's just putting it off in a different way. I think at some point we need to take more responsibility for our health. And I think the sooner we do that, the better off we're going to be, the better off our families are going to be. And the better off your health overall is going to be. This is not, my view is our lives are not just about, when we start thinking about fertility and having children, it's not just about what do I need to do to get pregnant. I think we need to think about this as, what do I need to do to have healthy children and healthy families? And that is a totally different thought process than what do I need to do to get pregnant? We want to create healthy children, healthy people, to have healthy generations in your family. And that starts with you at the beginning, right? And that starts with what you can do to take care of yourself. And that's what I mean by taking ownership and responsibility of our own health, as opposed to giving it up to somebody else. And that's really fertility preservation in my mind. It's not, you know, freezing eggs. Again, I did mention earlier, like there's certainly a place for egg freezing, and there's certainly a place to either donate or use egg donors for your fertility. But that is totally different than what is being expressed to young women about kind of egg freezing, because that is more looking at their fertility or this egg freezing process as like an insurance policy, like, oh, we're going to do this just in case. You know, most people have insurance, so, but they don't want to use it, right? You know, like, I have health insurance, I hope I never have to use it. I've got car insurance, I hope I never have to call anyone to take care of repairing my car, or whatever insurance policy you have, right? Because there's a myriad of them out there. This to me is kind of talking in that same vein, like, oh, you should do this just in case you need this in the future. And yes, there's value potentially in that, but I would say fertility preservation and taking care of yourself is the same. I would view that in the same way, and it's much less expensive. What can you do as an insurance policy to take care of yourself now to preserve your fertility in the future? So I would have a different perspective on that. And that's where, you know, eating the right foods, exercising, taking care of yourself, getting enough sleep, which by the way is free, you know, is all what we should be thinking about in terms of health insurance to preserve our fertility.
Yes, I think that I talk about this all the time. I think that our branding is not as good as egg freezing's branding. Might have something to do with it. But it's true. Like I think I beat this drum all the time, but and I know you do too. But this idea that you can influence the quality of your eggs, because I think again there's another misconception out there. Well, your AMH is low, so that means your egg quality sucks, and that means you're doomed to potentially not have a baby or to have a really difficult time. So it's all this messaging that's so insidious in our society that tells women that these numbers or this, this age or this hormone level don't mean bad things for you. And they're never told, well, actually, you could reverse all of that. You can change all of that. And it doesn't take that much, as you well know from the work that you do. It doesn't take, I mean, sometimes in some cases we need a massive overhaul, but in
Yeah.
many cases you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'll say is the IVF doctors do not believe, the majority of them, I don't want to say all of them, the
Yeah.
majority of them do not believe that you can improve egg quality. So when they're telling you that, they don't believe that they're lying to you. And in their mind, they're not. They're just telling you what they think is true. What I want everyone here listening and hearing is that it's absolutely possible. We see it all the time. You can be more fertile and healthier at 35 than you were at 25, right? And you spoke about it. And I see this all the time. And even like I just got off of a coaching call for my program, and one of the women was just like, I can't tell you how grateful I am for everything you have done. She's not pregnant, by the way, like, but she feels healthier. She feels stronger. She feels like she's in a much better place. And her words were like, even if I don't get pregnant, the value that I've received was so great because I feel better. I'm healthier. I have you to rely on. I don't have to guess about things. Like, I can't remember everything else she said, but it was along those lines. And that's really what is possible if we take more responsibility of our health and our hormones, instead of thinking that like everything's a pill or a procedure or whatever it might be to preserve things. So again, there's a time and a place for everything, but I think we're overdoing it when it comes to egg freezing unnecessarily. And I think that needs to be looked at. Like, just because your employer is offering this to you doesn't mean that there's a problem that you need it, that needs to be fixed, right? Like, we need to look at that in a different light.
Yes, totally. We totally do. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about actual success rates for egg freezing.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, I believe they vary by age, but again, that's requires a more nuanced conversation, because obviously age isn't the only factor that's going to be playing into the success of something like this, as we just talked about. So are I know that I think that the messaging is different depending on the clinic that people are going to and whatnot, but do you feel like, maybe this is a little harsh, but are women being sold a lie when it comes to the success rates of egg freezing and, from a frozen egg to a live birth?
Yeah, I think that I don't think that they're being sold a lie. I think they're misled, or they misunderstand the whole process.
Oh, okay.
And I think that it's really important that we understand, when we're talking about success rates, there's two things here that we're talking about. Were we successful in getting as many eggs as we can and freezing them? And then the next piece is, how many embryos can we create from those eggs to even try to get pregnant with them? And those are very different numbers. Okay. So first is, we have to think about the freezing process. So the freezing process has changed dramatically over the years, and gotten better. Okay. But with that being said, you have a much higher likelihood of being able to freeze and thaw successfully an embryo versus an egg. Okay. And I want to say that again, because we've been talking about egg freezing. You have a much higher success of freezing and thawing an embryo versus an egg. So if you do a cycle, you get 20 eggs, they all look good, and you freeze them, the likelihood of having all 20 to be fertilized later and used as embryos is unlikely. Okay. So there's different stages here. The first thing is, so not all follicles have eggs inside them, although the younger you are, the more likely that it is a 1-to-1 ratio. But let's just say you have 20 follicles maturing, and they go in for retrieval, and some were immature or some were empty. It's not uncommon to end up with like 17 or 15 eggs at that point. And then if they look at those eggs, and maybe not all eggs are mature or of good quality to be frozen. So let's just say maybe that number drops down from 17 to 15, or 15 to 13, or whatever that is. So we started with 20. Now we're at a different number. Now we have that number, they've been frozen, and you come back 2 or 3 years later, or 5 years later, and you're like, okay, I'm married, I've got my partner, we're in love, we want to fertilize those eggs and have embryos and get pregnant. Great. So we thaw them. Some clinics have a very, very high success rate of thawing eggs and keeping them healthy, like 99%. Others do not. So it depends on the embryology lab and the clinic. But if you fall into one of those places where you don't have all of those, so let's just say we started off with 15 that were frozen, you might end up with 10 that made it through the thaw. Now we went from 20 to 10. Now we're at 10. We've got to fertilize all those. The likelihood of having all 10 fertilized with your husband's sperm is not 100%. So let's just say we went from 10 to 9 or 8. Now we're at 8, and now we're at 8 embryos, right? The likelihood of those developing from an embryo to the 3rd day to the 5th or 6th day where you would freeze them typically drops off over those days. So maybe you started with 8 embryos, and you might end up with 6 or 5 on day 5 or 6 that you would then refreeze or transfer 1 or 2 of those. So you started with 20. You're thinking, I've got 20 babies. You're not probably going to have 20 when you get to that point in time where you're at the end of that process. So when we're talking about the success rates, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about the success of being able to retrieve as many eggs and freeze them? Are we talking about how many of those eggs turn into embryos? Are we talking about how many of those embryos turn into good 5 or day 6 blastocyst embryos to be transferred? Or are we talking about a pregnancy when we're talking about success rate? What are we looking at, right? So those numbers vary from beginning to end, and will vary from clinic to clinic depending on their embryology lab and their embryologist and their success rates.
Whoa. Okay. Talk about nuance. I feel like you've just broken that down for everyone in such an amazing way because obviously I'm not thinking about any of that stuff. I mean, I'm looking online and I'm seeing clinics and they're talking about a 35% chance of going from your frozen egg to your live birth. But I feel like what you just described is nothing compared to what they just said there. That 35% doesn't even really compute.
Yeah. So what they're thinking of is they're not thinking of, I have 20 and I'm going to have 20 egg embryos to transfer. They're thinking about from the 20, can we get one positive HCG pregnancy test and potentially have a live birth?
Right.
That's what they're thinking about. So when they're giving you that 30 or 35% success rate, that's what they're thinking about, is that entire thing from I've got 20 and you're going to get a positive pregnancy test and deliver a healthy baby.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Right.
I mean, it's a little misleading, no?
Well, if we don't, so the doctors, the nurses, the PAs that you're talking to make 2 assumptions. One is that you understand what they're doing, so they don't have to explain it. And if they don't ask the questions, we don't have to answer it because my assumption is that they understand what they're doing.
Right.
They also take for granted what they're doing because they're in it so often that they make some misconceptions that the patient understands every process that they're going through and the whole process. And in general, they don't. So unless you're an advocate for yourself, excuse me, and you're asking a lot of questions, and most people don't like to ask a lot of questions because they feel like they're bothering somebody and they're doing a good job and they're working for me. So I don't want to upset them and bother them. So I don't want to ask questions. But the reality is you need to be asking questions, and you need to be asking a lot of questions, and you need to understand the process as fully as possible so that you are clear and you have the proper expectations in the beginning. You understand what you're looking for towards the end, and that all your questions are answered. And you will have questions as you go through that you didn't think of in the beginning that you should feel okay asking and getting clarity on. And if they're not answering them, then you need to either ask again or you need to find a clinic or doctor who will answer your questions for you. So I think part of it is that patients don't want to bother their medical professionals. And the other part is that the medical professional believes that the patient that they're working with understands the process, or they would ask them a question if they didn't.
Right. 100%.
Yeah.
I think that this is just really insightful for anyone who is considering this process or even who had questions about it. You talked about helping some of your clients prepare for this procedure. Do you ever recommend testing or anything like that, or any kind of evaluation before someone starts preparation for an egg freezing procedure?
100%. I mean,
Yeah.
no clinic should move forward with something like this without doing at least some bare minimum of testing, hormone testing, and evaluation. So they'll do some really just bare minimum hormone testing, FSH, LH, estradiol, AMH. But I like to go well beyond that because for me, their health, their reproductive health is so much more than just those few hormones. And so I like to do as much of an evaluation. I think maybe we talked about it on the last interview, like the depth of testing to do to really understand what your health is like, what areas need attention, how much time do we need to give to make those changes so that way we can be in as best shape as possible for that that egg retrieval, when we get there. So absolutely, I think we need to be proactive. And when I was saying, hey, let's prepare for 3 months before. Like the fourth month before that, we should be doing the testing so that you've got 3 months of time to prepare, once we know what's going on and how to support that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've talked about dietary changes and things like that. Is there anything else that you would say to someone who is considering doing this process?
Most people who are thinking of doing this process, I would guess, are going to be somewhere between 25 and 35.
Mhm.
So I'm making a generalization. It's not entirely accurate, but the majority are. I know what most people who are between 25 and 35, how they live and what we do.
We've all
And
been there.
we've all
That's
been
why
there.
we know.
Yeah. And I would say some of us still think we're there.
Yep.
um, I would say that we need to start thinking about things differently. Like it's no longer party time. This is time to really it's time to take care of ourselves. What are you going to do to get enough sleep? What are you going to do to prioritize your health and make sure you get enough exercise, to eat right? Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to be proactive? And I think most of us can objectively look at our personal life and say, okay, I'm doing a little too much here. I'm not doing enough there. Let me clean up these things and let me give myself a little bit of time to do that. And I think that's really the mentality we need to take. Like, I want to run a marathon in 6 months. I need to prepare to do that. And I need to start to build up my miles. In my mind, this is the same thing. I want to either bank my eggs in the future or I want to get pregnant in the future. What do I need to start doing now that I can slowly start to integrate these things and build up and make incremental changes so that when I get to that point in time, I'm much healthier, my hormones are much healthier, and my eggs are much healthier than they were, 6 months or whatever before. So that's the way I would approach it.
So good. Thank you. This was so enlightening. I truly can't believe all that you shared in not a very long period of time. Thank you so much, Mark. This is great. Can you just talk a little bit about how you work with clients and how they can work with you? I feel like your
Sure.
services are amazing.
Yeah. So I support couples through a coaching program. I'm there to coach them through their process, whether they're trying to prepare their body to freeze their eggs, whether they're trying to prepare their bodies to get pregnant naturally or go through an IVF cycle, whatever it is, our program is designed to really support each individual by assessing their specific needs, creating a specific plan for them, and then coaching and supporting them through that process to get that result. So 50% of all the couples who are in my program are trying to conceive naturally, and the other 50% are trying to conceive through either IUI or IVF for various reasons. And we're there to meet them where they are. So that's kind of how that program works. Yeah.
Amazing. And your website, if you wanted to
Oh,
share that with everyone.
marksklar.com is my website. You can find out more information there. And then I'm on all the different social media locations as well.
I know, right? Everywhere. We're doing it all, guys. We're doing it all. Mark, thank you again so much. This was amazing. Such good information. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap. Be sure to click that subscribe button to join me for more Girl Talk Gone Menstrual in upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, check out my latest Period Party episode. And if you're looking for a deeper dive into your hormones, go ahead and take my period quiz at nicolejardim.com/quiz.